Welcome to today's special webinar hosted by AML Intelligence and SymphonyAI. Today we're doing a deep dive into the results of FinCrime Frontier 2025-2026, the most comprehensive report on the state of readiness in the FCC sector. Setting new standards for data in the industry, the report provides the banking and insurance industries with key insights on AI, technology, innovation, and regulation. It involved 42 structured questions and was completed by 250 senior FCC professionals. I'm especially delighted to be joined by two incredible experts, Charmian Simmons and Elizabeth Callan, who will help interpret the results of the benchmark FinCrime Frontier report. And most importantly, they will help us understand the key learnings and strategic insights that are important for AML and compliance leaders as we move into 2026. It's great to see so many professionals join us here today from right across the globe. So jump into the chat tool and tell us from where in the world you're joining. We are recording this session, which will be made available later. Furthermore, if you have any questions, please input them into the Q&A and we'll try to get around to them before the end of the discussion. First up, turning to Charmaine and Elizabeth, great to see you both, and I'm excited about hearing your insights. For our attendees, tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do. Maybe starting with you, Charmaine.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And listen, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm based in London. I'm Charmian Simmons. I am a financial crime and compliance expert with SymphonyAI. I predominantly cover the UK, Europe, Middle East and Africa region. Anything to do with policy setting, technology, regulations, you name it, we're there to cover off on the industry. And I'm hopefully, seeing you guys at many of the conferences and look to engage with you today.
Great. Thanks so much. Elizabeth?
Good morning, good afternoon. Elizabeth Callan. Thank you all for joining today. Excited about the conversation. I've been in AML and financial crime and sanctions for about 25 years now. A big part of that was with the US government across law enforcement and intelligence, including CIA, our Treasury Department, and our Drug Enforcement Administration. After that, coming out into the private sector, I've worked across financial institutions, managing investigative teams, supporting strategic, senior leadership teams, consulting, building programs, especially for sort of complex products and services. And then more recently in my career, technology. I've been with SymphonyAI for about 4 years now. My role is a subject matter expert, really supporting our North America teams, driving product development, but also our sales and business development.
Yeah, fantastic. And as I say, it's great to have such accomplished experts from across the sectors join us here today. So great to have you, Elizabeth, and great to have you, Charmaine. I suppose what I'd really like to start with is maybe with you, Elizabeth. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the most comprehensive benchmark of AML and FCC people and trends really in the industry and right across banking and insurance. So maybe starting with you, what surprised you most about the findings in this report?
Yeah, I think for this one, Stephen, I'd focus on the KPI issue. So we did have a survey question around a KPI framework. What was interesting is that about 30% of respondents reported that they have no mature KPI framework for outcome-driven innovations. So, AI is great. There's so much that it can do. But if you're not really instituting measures of how either efficient or effective that AI is making your program, then there's really no way to demonstrate it either internal to the institution or external to your regulators. The top 3 reported KPIs for those that do have some measure of AI-driven outcomes was false positive rate, number 1, case resolution time, number 2, and detection accuracy, number 3. So we see the first 2 are very focused on efficiencies. And they're very simple measures, false positive rates. We've been dealing with that for decades. And sure, that's a very important result and value that AI can drive in your program. Same with case resolution time. But there's so much more in terms of measuring effectiveness and assessing your program on the effectiveness side, right? So we have number 3, detection accuracy. It was much lower than the first two. I think the first two combined came to about 50% of respondents chose one or two of those top two responses. Number 3 was around 18%. So
Okay.
it just goes to show that I think a lot of programs are focusing on efficiency more than effectiveness. And so I think it's important to keep in mind when measuring the value of AI, what it's bringing to your program. Efficiencies might be more important to your institution, obviously driving down costs, making staff more productive. All of that is very important to the institutions. But I think we also have to think about what's important to the regulators. And of course, that's going to be in more of the effectiveness realm. So, when we think about what some of these measures can be, and there's so many, so obviously I'm not going to give a comprehensive list, but I did want to isolate a few. So when we think about detection capability, a very simplistic KPI, but I think one that's powerful is, you could try to look at your percent of SARs originating from AI only models, right? That's going to tell you if your AI is actually surfacing risks outside of, your historical knowledge or what you've already known about and you're applying rules-based monitoring to. I think another category is around false negatives, right? So we always think false positives, it's noise. Yes, it's a lot of burden on the teams, but depending on, what your regulators are like, false negatives, potentially can be even more important than false positives in terms of the risks they create. So, a potential metric around false negative exposure is looking at back testing your hit rate on historical typologies. So, you may have historically been monitoring for it with a rule, and you might want to look at the delta between that historical monitoring and what you're getting now from potentially AI-driven monitoring. So that'll tell you something about that false negative exposure that you might have had over, sort of years or decades. Also alert quality and efficiency, but I think you can also look at this measure as, again, applied to false negative exposure. You can look at things like precision on low risk to high risk reclassification. So, with your prior monitoring system, you may have had alerts that were rated low risk. When you apply AI, you may actually find out that those alerts are actually of high risk. So that delta is going to tell you a little bit about sort of the alert quality, but also, again, those false positives that you might be missing. And then lastly, adaptability and learning. Obviously, this is absolutely critical for, how many institutions are using AI, right? It's really all about the AI getting better over time with more data, with more experiential learning, applying the AI. Is it actually generating outcomes, right? So you can look at model drift versus typology shift, right? And so what that's going to tell you is if the model is drifting and that drift is high, but the detection remains stable, that's going to tell you something about, is your model adapting to new patterns? And so, of course, those being able to detect those new patterns goes directly to effectiveness, goes directly to driving better outcomes, understanding your risk profile, being able to deliver a true risk-based approach. So really important, all these measures, and to really have a sort of KPI coverage map. And I think, just a couple of practical tips, and then, I'll stop there. You can do things such as red team analysis or using synthetic data to kind of generate different exercises around typologies to see how the AI is mimicking what you were able to what you were able to find in the past, but how that AI is driving deltas in the type of typologies that it's able to actually detect. You can also tag SARs as either AI only, rule only, or both. That's going to allow you to more easily track where these risks and alerts are sort of being surfaced from. And then you can also benchmark against like rule-based baselines to kind of compare to what your rules-based monitoring only was generating versus, bringing AI into the mix and how that's generating your outcomes.
Yeah, amazing. Great stuff there, and really some really rich insights. Turning to you, Charmaine, and clearly there's a huge amount of data here, and there's so much rich information to be unpacked. But to you, what surprised you most from the survey?
Yeah, I think the KPIs were one, definitely. I know writing that section was quite an interesting one to interpret a lot of the results for how people are actually thinking about it. But for me, there's probably another three different areas that I would highlight as a little bit surprising in terms of the results. One I would say is sort of the barriers and the challenges that we've seen. Particularly around those, I would say everybody has gone back with the classic kind of barriers and challenges that we've seen. And Elizabeth sort of mentioned it before, everyone's going for false positives, right? We haven't sort of gotten to the part where we've addressed those types of challenges to be able to move forward with how we become more efficient, how we become more effective, how do we actually sit there and address some of the business strategy needs as opposed to just fighting what we've currently got in the environment. And when it came to the survey, some of those sort of pieces around sort of those barriers and challenges, or two that actually kind of stood out to me. One was around technical debt. And only about 20% of people talked about legacy systems being sort of a limitation somewhere in their process, which means to me, that means everybody else has more newer tech, everybody's using everything, everyone's really happy about what they're doing. But I don't think that's the reality. So I think that's one surprising one.
Okay.
The second surprising one in that challenge was around budget constraints and costs. I think only about 21% people said that was sort of a challenge or a barrier going forward. And again, I'm really surprised that that number was actually that low when we talk about sort of innovation and we talk about how we're thinking about the elements around sort of people alignment or operating efficiency. That was one of those sort of key highlights. If I look about the second bullet point I put here about measurable ROI, this kind of ties a little bit into what Elizabeth was just talking about from a KPI perspective. You've got to be able to measure your return on investment at some point to know whether or not it's effective is actually delivering what you're expecting. Now, when we looked at the survey results, about the top sort of five, if we look at how they're measuring ROI, was really about 35% said transaction monitoring, 24% called out their KYC, CDD, onboarding, offboarding processes as being, ones that they're tracking and realizing ROI in. And then it took a really big jump down from about below 10% for the next few around. And it really shifted. It went to things like efficiency and process automation. It went to like screening. It went to like fraud detection. So there's a really big sort of disparate between how operational institutions are actually realizing their ROI when it comes to how good they're actually performing. And then that really leads me into that third one where we're talking about how much you're thinking about forward planning and prioritizing when it comes to using AI. AI is great. It is a very effective tool when it's applied in the right areas, but it doesn't have to be applied everywhere. And I think in order to realize what those benefits are and the outcomes, you really need to be able to look for what are you trying to address? What does that outcome going to give you in terms of high impact and high value? And those sort of things were very, let's say, elementary in terms of how they've been introduced and how people are thinking about that going forward.
Yeah, lots there. As you say, measurable ROI is so important. And clearly, yeah, the 21% saying compliance costs, that struck me as well. I got a surprise out of that one. And then another area, Elizabeth, that struck me going through it here is one of the things that struck me was respondents mentioned transaction monitoring and KYC, CDD were the two areas they wanted to focus with AI. But what do you think? What are the other innovative use cases, possibilities they could consider?
Yeah, there's just so much, right? And I think you can apply AI obviously throughout an organization, right? It doesn't just have to be
Yeah.
financial crime applications, but keeping obviously within the financial crime realm. What I think is really interesting is what's happening in sanctions. So obviously there's lots we can do in transaction monitoring. There's lots we can do in KYC, CDD. But I think what's really interesting is where we can take sanctions compliance programs with this type of technology. Because what we've always had for decades and decades has been screening. And of course, any financial institution will easily tell you how pretty much fed up they are with screening. It's mostly false positives. It ultimately becomes a false positives management exercise. And obviously, more and more attention is being put on sanctions evasion as opposed to just merely looking for a name that might be out there on a list. But that's easier said than done, right? With the tools that we've always had. And so I think the advent of AI, and in particular agentic AI, is really arming us with different tools that's going to enable us to not only evolve sanctions compliance programs in general, but really dig into the sanctions evasion problem. And, obviously, OFAC being one of the key regulators worldwide, not just from a U.S. perspective, but the international reach that OFAC has, they're much more focused on sanctions evasion, certainly since the start of the Russia-Ukraine problem, but ramping up since then. I think they've uncovered a lot of areas that most people would think are low risk for money laundering or even just parking illicit assets. But I think OFAC has done a lot of work in showing that there's a lot of evasion happening in these areas. But how do we detect it? So at Symphony, what we're talking about with a lot of clients is being able to use not only LLMs, but agentic AI to capture and exploit the rich information that's out there, everywhere. It can be quantitative data, qualitative data, but leveraging that data and that information to not only enrich alerts and help make better decisions around screening alerts, because obviously that's a benefit as well. But how can we leverage that information to find these more complex sanctions evasion typologies? In addition to that, I think there's a lot that can be done around workflows. A lot of our clients are concerned about, the flexibilities they have with their workflows. Can agentic AI automate those workflows? I think the obvious one is just, picking up an existing workflow and having agentic AI automate it from end to end. But I think where it starts to get more interesting is that over time, how is the AI able to help you refine those workflows? Maybe there's better ways to do it. Maybe there's more efficient ways to do it. Maybe there's more effective ways to do it in terms of, now that you have an automated system, are there other elements of the institution that can be brought in, or other data sources that can be brought into that workflow to ultimately make the outcome of that workflow more effective, while also increasing the efficiency, obviously. And then lastly, creating new workflows, right? So if we look at the sanctions evasion example, as we learn additional ways to apply these different types of AI in that context, there may be wholly new workflows to these teams that they've never really used before, right? Because you're going after that risk in a new way. So really creating completely new workflows to target a completely new goal. And then lastly, and I think in some ways this might be the most interesting use case because it's so burdensome, and that's the risk assessment, right? The annual AML and sanctions risk assessments. So some people, might be a little bit more standoffish when it comes to sort of strategically thinking about your risks. I think there's a place for AI to help sort of frame that, right? Pull in information, identify risks that, internal to the institution, you can evaluate and determine what that risk profile looks like. But there's a lot of sort of mechanical work that goes into the risk assessment. And so can we use agentic AI to help automate a lot of that? Right? Especially when it comes to conducting surveys, from the second line of defense to the first line of defense. How can we use AI to really speed that up and, potentially make it not only more sound in sort of the statistical rigor, but potentially make it more robust in terms of the type of information that's being used behind those risk assessments. So I think that's another really interesting use case.
Yeah, 100%. I think that'll be music to the ears of a lot of people watching in, especially, how you can use AI, agentic AI on sanctions evasion, workflows, and dare I say, as you mentioned, risk assessments. So a lot of heavy lifting to be done there, and this is where agentic AI can help. And I guess, Charmian, that's a nice segue into something I'd like to ask you about, and that's regulatory readiness, which is a big part of this survey as well. And thinking about regulatory readiness and innovation, one I penned down for you is how are regulators approaching innovations such as AI and related model risk management, and what do they ask of financial institutions?
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory readiness is a really interesting area to think about. And for me, part of this comes down to what processes do they need? What technology do they need in order for all of these things to sort of come together? And that blend between the processes, the control, the technology becomes a really important orchestration to get everything to work together. And when we talked about this with, the team reviewing all the responses out of here, what became really obvious to us is that we're still very much reacting in a reactive mode. We're not really going into proactive in terms of how we're looking at things going forward. And that proactive side is actually really quite interesting. So when we looked at these particular results, a lot of this came back to, well, are you fully prepared? Are you somewhat prepared? How prepared are you when it comes to regulator ready? And if you have a look at in these particular charts here, the blue, the green, and the pink are kind of like the interesting ones to look at here. They're showing us that in a lot of different areas, by the way, these numbers do exceed 100 in here because people could put down multiple areas depending upon the area that they worked within. It shows us that there is very much a disparate meaning between where people are actually using technology, where they're updating their processes, and where they're influencing controls into the right way. So from this particular context, when we look at what the technology is actually driving, people are in very interesting stages of where they're talking about AI readiness, where they're talking about the regulators coming together and how the regulators are using it. Now, one thing that we do know is the regulators are in a lot of different pockets around the world. They are very much, I'd say, favorative for how AI, new technologies and new innovations can actually help with driving better financial crime results, better outcomes, better efficiency, better effectiveness. A lot of them are doing it through sandboxes and those types of approaches. And some of them are also now starting to move from a sort of innovation type of a area and helping to actually train the supervisory teams and the actual examiners on the ground in what does that mean. And for them, there are some non-negotiables they have around things like governance, things like model validation. What does that mean for a team to be ready? It really means they need to staff up, they need to educate, they need to actually pull in the right types of people in their teams in order to understand what is model governance if they are using AI, what is other types of controls they might in a quality function or in a QC function or in a COO area in order to manage what they're seeing across the board from a process perspective, a control perspective, and a technology perspective. The other sort of parts around this is also going to be the regulatory side of it. Regulation is changing quite heavily in the coming year. We've got pockets around the world that are actually ramping up in their regulatory expectations, and in some cases, we're seeing they're retracting, particularly North America at the moment. The US has retracted back some of those regulatory side, but Europe, for example, is really ramping up. Australia is really ramping up. So it's about how you're going to mix that process, that control, and that technology elements in order to actually meet those requirements.
Yeah, and that blend is going to be really important as this geopolitical environment still evolves, and we see some certainty, and that could be years away. Elizabeth, staying on regulation, I'd like to turn to you and ask you what practical steps should compliance leaders take today to stay ahead of those regulatory expectations?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I think in some ways, it's not just staying ahead of them, it's helping them along. Our regulators here in the US are certainly still in a learning pattern. We don't really have much legislation or regulation yet around AI specifically. And so certain institutions are kind of almost in a wait and see approach as to what they're going to do. But I think we shouldn't necessarily wait for that because, getting involved with the regulators can kind of help bring them along. So, I think one of the first steps is really about strong governance and documentation. Governance has obviously been around forever. I think it's going to evolve quite a bit as AI becomes a bigger part of our programs, as we start to see that human AI sort of proportion change across programs, where AI is becoming a bigger part of a program and the output of that program, and maybe the human element is changing, decreasing to a certain extent, and what that mix looks like. But so governance is certainly going to look different 5 to 10 years from now. But it's still very important to focus on, within that, everything from model risk management to, defining roles and responsibilities, policies, procedures, your controls, everything written down, and a governance structure built around that, because you really want your AI to support rather than undermine what you're doing. And I think part of that is going to be by demonstrating to your regulators what you're doing in this sort of new area, but you're being responsible with it, right? So you're not just jumping into the deep end with all this new technology, but you don't really understand how to put sort of responsibilities around that and a proper governance infrastructure around that. You want to engage them early and often. Like I said, I don't think it's so much about staying ahead of them. I mean, of course, you want to be able to satisfy your regulators, but I really think it's bringing them along. In particular, where you have regulators that, or jurisdictions where the regulations aren't very prescriptive yet, aren't very transparent yet. You want to get in with those regulators early, help bring them along in your journey, so that what the outcome is, what those regulations end up looking like, is potentially more friendly, right, to your business. And the way to do that is proactive dialogue for sure. Help them learn about how this technology works, how you're applying it, and what you're doing to ensure that you're responsibly doing all of that. Of course, data quality is critical. Everything hinges on data. Most types of AI leverage data, right, at the foundational level. So your data quality is absolutely key. It relies on clean data, bias tested data, looking at data lineage and tracking any edits that are happening in your data, and just ensuring that there's accurate, fair. That's a big one, actually, because what we have seen out of AI developments in the US has primarily been around bias so far. So bias is certainly important. And so fairness in what you're doing with AI, I think, is important. And of course, that defensibility aspect. And then very close to that is explainability and human in the loop. Nothing AI related should be employed without being able to properly explain it. So, working with your vendors to understand how they do things, what they're able to supply you with in order to use internally, but also externally with your regulators to prove that explainability. And then on the human oversight aspect, I think this is an important one, because I think we're going to see a lot of evolution in how programs use AI in the coming years. Some aren't so much today. They're sort of starting out in their journeys. Others are sort of on the more mature end of the scale. But I think it's really important to think about how you want to use humans in the loop right now. You might need to use more humans in the loop, more touch points across those process flows than you will, say, in 5 years. But I think it's incredibly important that you measure the amount of human intervention, human oversight when you're first starting out in particular, because that's going to allow you to, develop that confidence in how you're applying that AI and being able to demonstrate that to your regulators. And then, as you learn, as you sort of iron out the wrinkles, if you will, maybe those different human touch points, maybe they're going to decrease. Maybe they're going to be in different areas than where you originally had them. But it's certainly all about finding that balance and ensuring that you're able to explain what the AI is doing versus what the human is doing in that mix.
Yeah, really great insights there. And I do think regulators may not say it always, but I think regulators actually love AI. But they love it with those caveats that you mentioned, and that is fairness in what you're doing with AI. And also that I think your last point is probably the most important as well. Explainability and that human oversight matter. And that's key, absolutely key into how regulators will interpret what you're doing with AI. Okay, time is moving, and we've already unpacked a huge amount from the report. But now maybe I think we should look into what's happening in 2026 and what kind of trends we're seeing. I'm going to put one of my key what I think is going to be a key trend in 2026, and I think we're going to see AMLA, the European Anti-Money Laundering Authority, come out of the traps fairly soon in late 2026. I think they're under pressure to act. And they're saying, we'll be ready in 2027, 2028, but I think they'll be doing a lot by the end of 2026. So I think European regulators are going to be stepping up. We heard Bruno Zega tell the European Parliament she wants the agency to be a global leader, and I think that's putting the pressure on themselves already. So I think they will be under pressure from European Parliament and others to do something, and that direct supervision piece is going to be a really important piece. So clearly crypto is going to be a big one in the direct supervision. So as well as some of those bigger banks that go across borders. But turning to you, Charmian, what do you think? What do you see? What trends do you see in 2026?
Yeah, just to comment before I do that, just to comment on what you just said there. Yeah, the EU AMLA, I think that's going to be quite an interesting one for those that are based in Europe, those that do work across jurisdictional. There's a lot of stuff coming in around CDD comes, July of this year, the technical standards, the new changes that are going to have to come out. Do keep an eye on their website and the releases that are coming out. Do link in with places like AML Intelligence, SymphonyAI for what's actually happening in that area, because we are very closely tracking it. So just want to get that in there.
For sure.
For me, in terms of sort of trends and things for 2026, I think it would be probably a miss of me if I didn't call this one out. I would say more AI as just being the top headline. And I think that's really going to be about how do you leverage AI properly? And how do you realize that AI sort of tech value, but also the AI outcome value? So we sort of talked a little bit before about sort of the KPIs and being able to do, bits and pieces around that. It's going to be really, really important as we see the rest of the banking institutions, think front office, think parts of middle office, those that are customer facing, they're all increasing their use of AI, which means there's going to be more cloud adoption. It means it's probably going to lead to more cloud native sort of applications. And what that's going to do is make it a lot easier for the expansion of AI use cases across different business lines to come into play and be able to be adopted a lot more easily. And that's going to include compliance. Now, the other side of what that more AI is going to really do, I would say, is probably a bit more sort of integration around sort of graph network analytics as well. I think we're going to go more from that sort of static side of things into more of a dynamic flow. And I think that will also help where we put your investment into what I would say would be the biggest use cases, the one's going to get your biggest bang for your buck. That's going to help with going from that reactive side into more of a proactive side. But probably the second sort of trend I would call out for 2026 is probably going to be more of that holistic view of risk. Now, how you get there is going to depend upon what your organizational goals are, what you're going through a transformation, what you're currently setting up. But if you think about banking customers, you think about crypto established, you think about payment wallet firms, PSPs, anybody that's in the non-even banking sector, so think of those DNFPBs, having a holistic view of risk is going to be really, really important in order to start connecting the dots around what's happening around transactions, businesses, behaviors, risk profiles, AI-driven, risk scoring, what's happening in these particular areas. You're going to have to be able to understand that holistic view of risk. And having that ecosystem that can pull in the right kinds of data, the right types of AI is going to be super important. One particular statistic that came from this report is that about 80% of institutions are planning or in the process of planning to do something with AI either this year or next year. And that comes from either doing it in an in-house team, it comes from them going and doing with a vendor, or them actually sort of employing data scientists into their organization, the compliance organization, not the tech organization solely, in order for them to advance that. So these types of things are only going to help them with what their use cases are for more AI, and also how they're going to achieve that more holistic view of risk. But let me just stop there.
Lots there, lots of trends to watch out for. The word I was struggling to find earlier before I went to you, Charmian, was crystal ball. So looking into your crystal ball, Elizabeth, what are the trends you're going to see in 2026?
I wish I had a true crystal ball, but I'll try my best. I think one of the top things is more of a focus on effectiveness rather than technical compliance. So we've been seeing these statements from the Wolfsburg Group for probably about 5 years now. And now we have an actual initiative in the US. It's still pending around modernizing our AML regime, which is really all hinging on effectiveness rather than technical compliance. A big part of that is, of course, based in the risk-based approach and a risk assessment, having a true risk assessment requirement here, which we don't currently have. Most institutions obviously do it, but it's not codified. So again, it's really all about effectiveness effectiveness, taking a true risk-based approach. How can technology help you do that? I think that's one of the key things, because I think it's going to be very challenging to make any kind of significant strides towards effectiveness without embracing some of these new opportunities in AI, and the opportunities to detect new risks, surface interesting risk, being able to have that context built around that risk so that the reports that you are filing are more useful and more informative to regulators, but really law enforcement, because whether you know it or not, they really are. When I was in law enforcement, we were really the key users of all of that material for the investigations we were conducting. So really providing that useful information for them to go and pick up and do their work with it. On the effectiveness side, I think another trend will be going sort of more regulatory focus on unique segments of financial services, things like the securities markets, investment advisors. So we've had this initiative to regulate our investment advisor sector over here. Our final rule was passed last year. The date for compliance has been delayed. However, I think that was partly due to the new administration coming in, putting a pause on, those rules that were passed just before they came into office. But what we're seeing the regulators do is actually take action in those areas. We saw FinCEN actually put out a risk assessment solely on that segment, which we've never seen before. So I think that emphasizes the risk that they believe is emanating from that sector, but also significant enforcement action since that time, including from OFAC. So I think that emphasizes the fact that those segments are not only sort of exposed to AML risk or money laundering risk, but they're also exposed to sanctions risk. And so I think that there's going to be more regulatory attention and more enforcement actions coming, because I think the regulators want to prove their point that there's problems there, and we have to do our best to sort of root them out. I think we'll have to see what happens with AI legs and regs here. Hopefully, we'll start to see some progress in that area. I think, like I said before, there's a lot of holding pattern going on because we just don't know how that's going to develop. So hopefully, we'll see more of that in 26. And then, like I said earlier, sanctions evasion, sanctions evasion, sanctions evasion. It's a key risk. It's hard to address. And I think it's something that technology is going to be a key part of. Just one last comment I'll leave you with. One of the things we're working on at Symphony, and I think it goes to all of these trends, is setting up your program to be sort of continuously learning and continuously driven by the regulations that are ever changing and the threats emanating from the criminals that are ever changing. So it's really about building a program and operating your program sort of continuously adapt to those changing regulations, continuously adapt to the threats, and allow the AI to sort of continuously update its reasoning. And so I think that is going to be a sort of a key underpinning to addressing all of these trends that are coming, because again, there's really no way to do it without the proper technology, and the technology that is working for you in such a way that your program is constantly being recalibrated, constantly being updated as these regulations and these threats change. So I think that we're going to see more and more of that, and certainly as a software vendor, we hope to be able to deliver more and more of that next year and beyond.
Really good. Agree with everything you've said there, and I suppose I'd double down on what you said on sanctions and evasion as well. So you can't say you didn't know. These are the trends our experts are highlighting into 2026. So make sure you note them and then put them into your organization's priorities for 2026. The questions are coming in fast and furious, so I think we need to go to the Q&A. So please use the Q&A to ask the questions rather than the chat, because that's where I'll be concentrating on. We've got one from Amy. Amy says, how much does AI depend on an organization to have holistic data versus AI that can add benefit no matter what data maturity an organization has? Who would like to take that one, Charmian or Elizabeth?
I can
Charmian, go for it.
Yeah, look, this is the question of, does AI need holistic data in order to work? No, technically it does not need holistic data across the board. It will work better if it is able to tap into the different components of it. And the reason I say that is, a lot of AI that's being deployed at the moment is very much within a particular function of the AML lifecycle. So it's within transaction monitoring, it's within sanctions, say, to do match accuracy, improve match accuracy. It's there for agents to sit there and talk to other agents in terms of an orchestration for them to work better. Now, when it comes to data maturity, yes, data maturity is very much needed. We're actually doing an exercise right now with one of the regulators in their sandboxes, and the cohort team that we're in, everybody is struggling with getting the right type of data. So being able to understand what your data quality is, what the transformation sort of program you're on is going to be quite necessary for you to get good results out of it. You can still use AI, but you're going to have to use it in a bit more of a limited function. And this is where I say AI is not for everything. Use it where it's going to give you high impact and high value, and look at what the outcome is that you're trying to achieve. If your outcome is to improve effectiveness, if it's to prove consistency in, say, investigations, if it's to lower the false positive rate, look at AI that actually does more of your predictive models, or look at AI that can pick up on a lot of the manual repetitive tasks. Look for it in the right areas. Your internal teams and your tech teams who are looking at the use cases should be able to help you with that, or any of the vendors that you're actually working with, like SymphonyAI, can actually walk you through what those particular processes are.
Very good. Yeah. Comprehensive answer
Stephen,
there. Elizabeth?
if I could just add really quickly, I think concisely how I would put it is I wouldn't think of evaluating your data in the context of just purely how the AI is going to use it. I think the way you need to think about what data sources you need or how much data you need is to really think about what you need to address your risks, to better understand your risks, right? So, obviously you don't want to wait for data to necessarily apply these types of tools, but if you're not using the right data sources or you're not using the right breadth of data and sort of your goal is to get that holistic view, or you're operating in a market segment where unless you have a more holistic view, you're not going to be able to really learn that much about what your true risks are or detect those risks, then you're probably not there yet, right? You probably have to do more on the data side
Sure.
to enhance the quality of the output. So I would think about it more in a risk perspective, and then the AI is just on top of that and delivering against that.
Mhm. Good. We're not going to get to all the questions, unfortunately, but maybe I'll throw one last one at you, Charmaine. Do you have a view on how fraud teams could use AI?
Yeah, there's a lot of different models at the moment that are available out there, specifically looking at the fraud types of use cases. So whether it's APP fraud, whether it's looking at mule accounts, whether it's looking at scams. Now, this again kind of goes back to the question we were talking about before, is you're going to need the right types of data sets in order to properly look at that. When we look at what the UK regulators are actually looking for, they're looking at how you're actually going to address those particular risks and minimize before they start getting through too far into the systems. If you miss the first few of them that come through, what are you doing to actually detect and actually stop and prevent what's going forward? So in a lot of these cases, it is going to be utilizing probably at this point in time, I'd be realistic and say a subset of actual rules that you know about and things that you're already doing to monitor and keep down those particular fraud risks, but as well as looking for those newer types of patterns, using some of the predictive models that are actually looking beyond what there is in order to address what the regulators are actually looking for.
Yeah, great stuff. Well said. I gotta say, we've run out of time. I have to say it has been a thoroughly enjoyable discussion and dialogue and really rich insights. From an AML intelligence point of view, I gotta say we've been thoroughly proud of the collaboration with Symphony AI. I think this is now the benchmark survey in the industry. Please socialize the survey and FinCrime Frontier with your colleagues and your network, because this is the place to go. This is the one-stop shop for where you need to go to learn about the industry and trends in the industry and the sector per se globally. I asked earlier where people had come in from, and they've come from everywhere: North America, US, Canada, Europe, Nordics, Africa, Caribbean. So everybody's here, everybody's represented, and it's all FCC leaders. So that's really good to see. So I think just to wrap, a quick fire at each of you. What were your top 3 takeaways from today? Starting with you, Elizabeth.
I would say get to know your technology and what's out there, how it can help your program. You ensure that you have ways to measure what that technology is doing to demonstrate it not only internally, but externally. And how, where we're going in the future is really about having a dynamic program. It's sort of continuous, always responding to regulations and threats, not static, but very much dynamic.
Good stuff. Charmaine?
For me, I would probably sit there and say, from this session today, download report. If you haven't, it's a good chance you can actually look at it. There's plenty of QR codes, opportunities for you to do so. It is comprehensive. We do thank everyone that did actually complete it. So thank you very much for doing that. Hopefully we can repeat this again next year and see how the needle has actually moved. The other one I would probably just call out at the moment is think about or continue to think about compliance as a strategic investment. And that strategic investment means, educating, utilizing your network the best you can, because there's a lot of change out there that's happening, whether it's, I'm going to go back to that process, that control, or that technology angle of it, but also to sit there and see what's going to be necessary for you to put things in place that's going to make you well-informed, very knowledgeable about what's happening, looking at the regulatory horizon, but also building the right type of a workforce that needs to actually be in that more proactive state about how we're looking at, managing financial crimes in the future and getting much more better at combating it overall.
Yeah, agree with you 100%. What a day. I have to say, wow. It's great to see experts at the top of their game explain the whole industry and what the trends are and the insights are. My two takeaways are, yes, download the report, and yes, Charmian well said, for thanking the 250 leaders who completed the survey. Really looking forward to doing this again next year, because then it's already a benchmark, but we actually have another benchmark to mark it against. So yeah, super excited about 2026's report. Look forward to collaborating with SymphonyAI again on this. And thank you, Charmaine, and thank you, Elizabeth. Look forward to collaborating into the future. And thanks for all your insights. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.